Mud, sticky rain, and smoke engulfed the battlefield. Visibility was low, and tracers flew everywhere. Friendly fire was not unusual. The American Abrams and British Challenger tanks were scattered in the low hills and depressions of the combat zone. Besides the mounting friendly casualties, the Iraqi tanks had breached the line and were firing from all sides. To further disorient the Americans, Iraqi infantry swarmed the tanks and jumped over them in a desperate attempt to throw grenades into the hatches or find a small gap into which they could fire their AK rifles. Nearby tanks did their best to help their fellow tankers and unleashed hundreds of machine gun rounds at close range to stop the swarm of infantry charging the Abrams and other vehicles. Chaos and skirmishes did not cease, and many officers doubted they would make it out alive until the morning. During the early hours of August 2, 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, who the United States government had previously supported during the local war against Iraq for the better part of the 80s, launched a grand-scale invasion of the small but oil-rich Kuwait. Hussein's regime had acquired an enormous debt from the conflict with Iran, and his economy was plummeting. His army was vast, and the servicemen were restless, eager for a more prosperous life. Hussein believed the economy would be fixed by taking over Kuwait, and his soldiers would be satisfied. 3 armored divisions of the elite Iraqi Republican Guard crossed Kuwait's border and raced for the capital without any significant obstacles from the local military forces. The helpless Kuwaiti military was disorganized and lacked proper military equipment to stop the Soviet-made tanks of the Republican Guard. Thousands of civilians and military personnel fled to Saudi Arabia. At the same time, the Iraqi army took control of the border and the rich oil fields of Kuwait. Iraq's army was over 1 million strong and adequately equipped by purchases made in international arms markets, including U.S. equipment. Nevertheless, most of Hussein's equipment was of Soviet design, one generation behind American armored vehicles. Main battle tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and small arms from the defunct Soviet Union remained the bulk of Iraq's military armament. The rest had been purchased from other Arab countries. The United States and other nations condemned the unjustified invasion and prepared an impressive force of over 35 militaries that began assembling in Saudi Arabia to push back the Iraqi troops to their own border. War loomed on the horizon. Desert Storm. The coalition, led by the U.S., initiated Operation Desert Shield and quickly fortified the border of Saudi Arabia for a possible enemy incursion. President George Bush urged Hussein to stop the occupation of Kuwait, but the Iraqi leader did not back down. What followed was the largest projection of American military power since World War II. The buildup had a purely defensive objective, but the army was ready to go on the offensive if necessary. Tensions between the coalition and Iraq continued until the early days of January 1991. By this time, the Iraqis had built formidable defenses in Kuwait, establishing trenches and depots and mobilizing more infantry, tank, and mechanized divisions. According to the book Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm from the Center of Military History, the line infantry was considered, quote, brittle, the regular army heavy divisions reliable, and the Republican Guard formidable. Hussein claimed the cost of liberating Kuwait for American and coalition forces would be higher than they could afford, saying, quote, "Yours is a nation that cannot afford to take 10,000 casualties in a single day." He was right, which is why the coalition troops took the necessary time to prepare for the operation. American, French, and British forces favored a direct approach, attacking Iraq without hesitation. However, the Arab allies preferred an indirect approach, liberating Kuwait first and limiting themselves to a broader war. Ultimately, the coalition opted for a hybrid plan that involved a direct approach followed by an envelopment of Iraqi troops, amphibious landings led by U.S. Marines, and an air assault deep into the heart of Iraq. Desert Saber. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991, with missile bombardments and massive airstrikes across Iraq. Coalition forces quickly established total air supremacy and neutralized the Iraqi command. Logistical support was decimated, and frontline units from Iraq were left at a disadvantage, due to the lack of supplies to fight their Western enemies. The only casualty suffered by coalition forces was the loss of 28 servicemen from the 14th Quartermaster Detachment of the U.S. Army, targeted by an Iraqi Scud missile. Nevertheless, U.S. intelligence and Allied aircraft hunted down Scuds before they became a threat to ground operations. While Marine forces feinted an amphibious landing, the 1st Cavalry Division engaged 5 enemy divisions, backed out, and rallied with the 7th Corps. The feints and deceptions by coalition units puzzled the Iraqi army and left gaps in its 200-plus kilometer coastline. The 7th Corps attacked Wadi al-Batin from the west and, after some skirmishes, took it from the Iraqi forces. Meanwhile, other coalition forces were surprised by Iraqi mechanized divisions near the small town of Hafji in Saudi Arabia on January 30th. Despite some ferocious urban combat between infantry and vehicles, U.S. air support drove off the mechanized columns of the Republican Guard and secured the town. Sticky rain. On January 24th, the coalition launched Operation Desert Sabre, attacking enemy forces from a line that stretched from the Persian Gulf 300 miles into the desert. The 18th Airborne Corps under General Luck had the western flank, held with the strength of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, the 24th Mechanized Infantry Division, the French 6th Light Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and the 12th and 18th Aviation Brigades. The 7th Corps was deployed to the right of the 18th Airborne Corps and comprised several American and British armored divisions, while the Marine Expeditionary Force and other Arab allies were deployed in the east. Iraqi resistance was high but futile. Rocket-propelled grenades did little damage to the armored columns of more than 3,000 tanks and thousands of armored support vehicles. Iraqi soldiers surrendered by the thousands after entire brigades and divisions were decimated. On February 25th, coalition forces destroyed the entire 10th and 12th Armored Divisions. Iraqi T-62 tanks proved no match for the 1900 U.S. M1A1 Abrams and British Challenger tanks that raced across the desert without obstacles. The unprepared Iraqi infantry placed at the vanguard were mostly conscripts who barely knew how to hold a rifle. However, as coalition troops broke into Iraq, the elite Republican Guard prepared for combat. The weather was dreadful, and an extraordinary rain greatly limited visibility. It was sticky, oily rain that was a combination of precipitation and smoke from several of Kuwait's oil fields that had been sabotaged by the retreating Iraqi forces. Fright Night. Commanding General Norman Schwarzkopf was surprised by the invasion's success and ordered the troops to keep pushing inward. The troops were weary, but kept advancing. On February 26th, coalition tanks clashed with the Iraqi armored forces from the Republican Guard, initiating the Battle of 73 Easting, marking the beginning of the Armored Ground War. The U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment and supporting units were engaged by a tank division of the Republican Guard. The 9 Abrams tanks, commanded by Army Captain H.R. McMaster, did not back down and charged into battle. After 23 minutes, the Americans destroyed 28 tanks, 30 trucks, and over 18 personnel carriers, with minimal damage suffered. Captain McMaster was joined by more than 800 Allied vehicles and continued the journey to Kuwait. 2 hours after the previous clash, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division and the 3rd Brigade of the 2nd Armored Division made contact with the 9th Armored and 18th Mechanized Brigades of the Republican Guard Tawakalna Mechanized Infantry Division and other units. Thus, the Battle of Norfolk, or Fright Night, began during the early hours of February 27th, under cover of darkness, heavy rain, and smoke. 100 Hours Offensive. The engagement saw the use of the powerful U.S. Abrams and the Challenger 1 main battle tanks against several iterations of Soviet-era tanks employed by the Republican Guard. Both sides also rushed other armored vehicles to the battlegrounds, including the M270 multiple launch rocket system and even helicopters from the U.S. 2nd Battalion 1st Aviation Division. The dark, rainy sky was illuminated by tracers from both armies. tanks fired blindly, not knowing if they were targeting friendly forces. Iraqi troops attempted to swarm the American and British tanks, climbing onto them and attempting to find a weak spot to place a grenade or even shoot into the cabin. The tankers were quick to respond and sealed their hatches, while tanks positioned nearby gave them a hand, firing against the swarm of enemies with lethal machine gun fire. As the coalition tanks maneuvered across low hills and other natural obstacles, Iraqi infantry surprised from all sides, appearing out of nowhere and firing RPGs at close range, attempting to destroy the vehicles from behind. Chaos engulfed the combatants. Retired Colonel and historian Gregory Fontenot, a veteran of the conflict, told the History Channel, quote, "Sometimes it would just be lines of tanks firing away at each other. It was a 360-degree battle." During the firefights, one Abrams fired a round at a friendly Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. The chaotic engagement ended with the loss of 6 Americans and 32 wounded. By the morning of February 28th, the coalition forces broke through and advanced toward Objective Norfolk, a portion of ground near the Iraq-Kuwait border that served as an Iraqi supply line. The capture of Norfolk and the Battle of Medina Ridge led to the ceasefire of the Gulf War. Estimates place Iraqi losses between 800 and 1,000 tanks, hundreds of armored vehicles, and thousands of soldiers. The encounter at Norfolk remains the second largest tank battle in U.S. history, after the Battle of the Bulge from World War II.